The kingdom of Zanza stood tall against the horizon, its grand palace gleaming under the sun, a symbol of wealth and power. Yet beneath its glittering exterior, corruption festered like a hidden wound. The marble halls, adorned with golden tapestries and precious jewels, were filled with whispers. Noblemen and women, once allies, now turned their backs on each other, their eyes watching, calculating. The courtiers, whose faces were expressions of grace and beauty, harbored hearts full of treachery. Every smile carried hidden meanings, every gesture masked by ulterior motives. The people of the kingdom, though respectful on the outside, carried fear in their hearts. Fear of their rulers, fear of their own futures, and above all, fear of being caught in the crossfire of the political warfare waging quietly behind the palace doors. Among all the political turmoil, there lived a girl named Zawadi, whose beauty was as legendary as the kingdom itself. Her skin was the colour of warm honey, and her long, dark hair cascaded down her back like a river of silk. Despite her exquisite appearance, Zawadi's beauty came with a price. It was both a blessing and a curse, drawing unwanted attention wherever she went. It was not just her beauty that made people whisper. There was an innocence in her eyes that only served to highlight the vulnerability she carried. Zawadi was raised in the palace, but she had never known true comfort. The luxurious surroundings, the opulent furniture, and the extravagant feasts did little to bring her happiness. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of her cruel stepmother, Morowa. Morowa, though appearing graceful and composed in the eyes of the court, was a woman whose heart harboured only selfishness and ambition. She had come to the kingdom from a faraway land, with promises of alliances and power. In her marriage to Zawadis' father, the king, Morowa saw a ticket to control, but Zawadis' presence in the palace was a threat to that control. Zawadis' life under Morowa's care was one of coldness and isolation. The stepmother made sure the girl never felt at home in the palace, no matter how much Zawadi tried to find solace in the ornate gardens that stretched behind the palace walls. It was in these gardens, among the fragrant flowers and the chirping of the birds, that Zawadi could escape for a moment and feel like a normal girl. Here, away from the suffocating atmosphere of the court, she allowed herself to feel free. But freedom was an illusion, and Zawadi was acutely aware of that. Though the garden was her haven, it was not enough to shield her from the icy grip of her stepmother's manipulation. Morowa was always watching, always calculating. She used her stepdaughter's beauty to her advantage, parading her around the court in grand dresses, yet never allowing her to feel the warmth of affection or true companionship. Morowa knew exactly how to wield her power. She kept Zawadi close, always in her grasp, but never truly loving her. The girl's beauty was the tool by which Morowa would climb higher in the palace, but it also became the source of resentment. Every time Morowa saw Zawadi in the gardens, her envy burned hotter. Zawadi, however, was blind to her stepmother's schemes. She believed that Morowa was acting out of love, that the harsh words and cold actions were simply the result of the pressures of court life. The girl's trust in her stepmother remained steadfast, though the reality of her situation was beginning to seep through her defences. It wasn't until late afternoons in the garden, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that she started to feel the weight of the palace's schemes bearing down on her. It was during these times that her stepmother's laughter, though distant, echoed in her mind, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Morowa's jealousy festered like an unhealed wound. Every day she watched her stepdaughter, who was adored by everyone for her beauty, while she, Morowa, remained in the shadows, a mere figure of power behind the throne. The nobles, despite their fear, spoke of Zawadi's grace, her kindness, and her pure heart, things that Morowa could never seem to attain. Morowa understood that Zawadi's innocence could be her downfall. If the girl remained in the court, she would become a symbol of virtue and goodness. something Morowa would never be able to surpass. The seeds of her plan were already planted, though the girl was unaware. As Morowa sat by the window of her chambers, watching Zawadi walk through the gardens below, her mind was already whirling with ideas. Zawadi, with her pure heart and beauty, was nothing more than a pawn in her game. The girl was unaware, but her life was about to take a turn that would change everything. In the silence of the palace, the political winds were shifting, and with them, the future of Zawadi. The sweet innocence that had made her beloved was slowly becoming the greatest threat to Morowa's ambition. But for now, Zawadi remained blissfully unaware of the trap closing in around her, continuing to walk through the gardens, dreaming of a life untouched by the cruel politics of the palace. Zawadi's life within the palace was one of constant, quiet suffering. Every day she carried herself with grace, but behind the veil of her beauty and kindness was a soul weighed down by the cruelty of her stepmother, Morowa. The life of luxury that surrounded her did nothing to ease the pain of feeling unwanted and isolated. The delicate whispers of the courtiers and nobles were not meant for her. They spoke of ambition, power, and betrayal, but Zawadi had no voice in the discussions. Instead, she endured Morowa's cold stares and sharp words in silence, her dreams of a peaceful existence seeming ever more distant. She had long ago learned to keep her head low, to be the invisible princess in the palace that everyone admired, but nobody truly saw. Her beauty had earned her the affection of the commoners and servants, who adored her as a symbol of purity and kindness. She would often walk among them in the quieter parts of the palace, a small smile lighting up her face as she shared simple conversations and exchanged pleasantries. To them, Zawadi was a breath of fresh air in the suffocating atmosphere of the palace. But to the nobility, she was a pawn in a game far greater than she could comprehend. The walls of the palace may have been gilded, but Zawadi found no warmth in them. Each passing day was an exercise in patience, as she waited for an escape that seemed increasingly unlikely. Her thoughts often wandered to the days when she was younger, before Morowa had entered her life. Back then, Zawadi had known joy, true joy, where laughter was shared freely, and love was felt without the bitterness of manipulation. But those days felt like distant memories, as if they belonged to another life, one that was forever beyond her reach. Now, as a grown woman, she had learned to live with the quiet ache of longing for peace, for freedom, for a life untouched by the shadows of palace intrigue. As the days dragged on, Zawadi's innocent nature only seemed to deepen the chasm between her and the world around her. She was often regarded with pity by those who saw her suffering, and her stepmother, in particular, revelled in the distance between them. Morowa saw in Zawadi not a daughter, but an obstacle. The girl's goodness and purity were a constant reminder of Morowa's own ruthless climb to power, and that was something Morowa would not tolerate. Prince Jafari, the crown prince of Zanza, had grown up in the palace under much different circumstances than Zawadi. Though the kingdom's wealth and power were his birthright, Jafari had never quite found his place within the royal family. Unlike his father, who was decisive and authoritative, Jafari was a young man of great intellect, but also one plagued by self-doubt. He had been groomed for leadership, but deep inside, he struggled to reconcile the expectations of the throne with his own uncertainties about the world around him. He had been thrust into the royal games of politics and power, yet he was not sure if he wanted to play the game at all. Jafari often found himself standing in the shadow of his father, unsure of whether he was truly ready to rule or if he even wanted the burden of the crown. He knew he had to prove himself, but each attempt felt like a step deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. The political maneuvering within the court was a maze, and Jafari was caught in the middle of it, unable to find a clear path. His confusion grew with each passing day as he saw the royal advisors whispering behind closed doors and the nobles scheming for their own agendas. He wanted to step out of the chaos, but he couldn't. Morowa, ever observant and cunning, recognized Jafari's vulnerabilities. She saw an opportunity to manipulate the prince to further her own ambitions, and she wasted no time in planting seeds of doubt in his mind. Morowa's influence over Jafari began with subtle words and casual suggestions, each one designed to make him question his place in the royal family. She spoke of loyalty, of honor, and of his duty to the kingdom. But her true intentions lay in the shadows of her words. She slowly began to turn Jafari's attention towards Zawadi, carefully hinting that the young princess might pose an obstacle to his future. Morowa planted the idea that Zawadi's innocence was not as pure as it appeared, and that her beauty and charm were but tools to distract him from his true purpose. Jafari's first encounter with Zawadi had been brief, a fleeting moment when their paths crossed in the palace corridors. He had looked at her, his gaze lingering for a second longer than was proper, but the moment had been fleeting. There was something about her, an air of sadness beneath her smile, that caught his attention. In that brief moment, Jafari had felt a strange pull, an unspoken connection that stirred something deep within him. But that was all it was, an unspoken connection. Morowa had been quick to notice the prince's interest, and with calculated precision, she began to manipulate the situation. She told Jafari stories about Zawadi, stories of her quiet nature, of her unassuming beauty, and of how her charm was a well-crafted facade. She spoke of the young princess's gentle ways, but Morowa made sure to point out that such innocence was often used to deceive those around her. She suggested that Zawadi's kindness was a mask for something far more dangerous, an obstacle to Jafari's own ambitions. Jafari, though intelligent and aware of his own doubts, was not immune to Morowa's subtle manipulations. He found himself growing uneasy at the thought of Zawadi, his interest in her waning as he became more wrapped up in Morowa's insinuations. The awkwardness between them grew whenever their paths crossed again. Jafari, unsure of what he truly thought of Zawadi, would glance at her with suspicion, while Zawadi, blissfully unaware of the rumors swirling around her, would smile shyly in response. Neither of them understood the growing tension that now clouded their interactions, but both felt the unease settle in their hearts. The tension between Zawadi and Jafari grew with each passing day, fueled by Morowa's quiet whispers. Their encounters, once innocent and brief, became laden with awkward silences and miscommunication. Jafari, unable to distinguish between truth and manipulation, was left feeling unsettled, while Zawadi continued her life, unaware of the web being spun around her. And in the shadows, Morowa smiled, knowing that her plans were unfolding just as she had envisioned. Morowa's manipulations grew ever more insidious as she worked her way deeper into Prince Jafari's mind. With every word she spoke, she crafted a twisted narrative that slowly poisoned the prince's thoughts about Zawadi. At first, the accusations were subtle, whispered in the darkest corners of the palace. Morowa would tell Jafari that Zawadi, in her naive way, might be unaware of the danger she posed to the throne, but that didn't make her any less dangerous. She insinuated that Zawadi's beauty and innocence could easily deceive even the sharpest minds, hiding dark intentions that could easily destabilize the kingdom. "Jafari, my dear," Morowa would say, her voice laced with feigned concern, "you cannot simply trust her. She is a pawn in a game much bigger than she knows. You've seen how she flutters around like a bird, but a bird can be a weapon in the wrong hands." Jafari, ever the thoughtful prince, began to listen to his stepmother's words with increasing attentiveness. Morowa had a way of making her ideas seem so plausible, so reasonable. She painted Zawadi as someone who may be plotting behind the scenes, working alongside unknown enemies to advance a secret agenda. Though Jafari had once felt an odd, unspoken connection with the princess, those feelings now seemed tainted by doubt. Morowa's words lingered in his mind, seeding suspicion. With every passing day, Zawadi's life became a web of misunderstandings. She, ever the innocent, had no idea what was being said behind her back. She continued to go about her days, unaware of the dangerous game that was being played around her. The air around her had started to shift. The warmth she once felt from the servants, and even the courtiers, was now laced with coldness. Their glances were quick, avoidant, and whispered conversations came to abrupt halts whenever she entered a room. At first, Zawadi assumed she was simply imagining things, but the silence that followed her wherever she went made it harder to deny that something had changed. It wasn't just the servants. Prince Jafari, too, seemed to be drifting farther from her. What had once been an awkward but sweet curiosity between them now felt like a distant, cold hesitation. The once bright gleam in his eyes whenever they met was replaced by an unreadable look, one that made Zawadis' heart ache with confusion. She had always believed that there was something in his gaze, something that spoke of kindness and understanding. But now, when she caught sight of him in the corridors or across the grand hallways of the palace, he would turn his eyes quickly away. The distance grew. Jafari's words, once polite and measured, became clipped and formal whenever they spoke. Zawadi no longer felt the warmth in his presence that had once comforted her. She could sense the growing coldness in the air between them, but she didn't understand it. Zawadi began to feel as though she were invisible, a mere ghost wandering through the palace that had once been her home. She would seek refuge in the quieter corners of the palace, her heart heavy with the feeling of being out of place. Why were people looking at her differently? Why did even the prince, whom she had once shared a fleeting moment with, seem to avoid her now? Though she could not understand the full extent of what was happening, Zawadi couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She began to question whether her stepmother's cruel treatment was the only reason for her isolation. Was there more to it? In the midst of this growing confusion, Prince Jafari wrestled with his own turmoil. He had always prided himself on his sharp mind and discernment, but now those very qualities seemed to work against him. The seeds of doubt Morowa had planted took root in his thoughts, and he found himself second-guessing everything about Zawadi. He had begun to fear that his feelings for her, however genuine they seemed, were clouding his judgment. Could he afford to allow those feelings to grow? His duty to the kingdom, his responsibility to the throne, was far too important to be influenced by a mere princess, especially one who might harbour intentions that threatened his family's legacy. But as Jafari wrestled with these thoughts, a deeper conflict arose within him. Beneath the doubt, there was still something stirring, a deep, instinctual pull towards Zawadi that he couldn't entirely suppress. The more he tried to push those feelings away, the stronger they seemed to become. He wanted to believe in her innocence, in the goodness that seemed to radiate from her, but the whispers of Morowa, combined with his growing fears, made it hard for him to trust his heart. Prince Jafari now found himself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to follow. Should he follow the dictates of duty, push aside his feelings, and protect the throne at all costs? Or should he trust his instincts and the bond he felt with Zawadi, despite the ever-growing suspicion clouding his judgment? The growing tension between the prince and princess became palpable, yet neither of them could understand the true cause. For Zawadi, the coldness of those around her had become a crushing weight, and for Jafari, his growing suspicions became a constant source of inner turmoil. As Morowas' manipulations deepened, so did the rift between the two, each of them unaware of the true enemy they were both facing. In the quiet halls of the palace, the tension thickened like a storm ready to burst, and all the while, Morowa watched from the shadows, her dark smile reflecting the success of her plan. The grand hallways of the palace, once filled with the lively chatter of courtiers and the soft melodies of a palace string quartet, now felt hollow and oppressive to Zawadi. The tension in the air was suffocating, wrapping around her like a heavy cloak that she couldn't escape. She moved through the corridors with a quiet, measured grace, her heart heavy with confusion. Why had things changed so suddenly? Why was everyone, including Prince Jafari, acting so cold towards her? Zawadi's mind often wandered to her stepmother's cruel words and the strange behaviour of the courtiers. The seeds of doubt planted in Jafari's mind were beginning to show their effects, but she couldn't understand why. She had done nothing wrong. She had only ever been kind and honest. But even as she tried to convince herself of this, a gnawing doubt whispered in the back of her mind. What if she was missing something? What if there was something more to the story that she couldn't see? It was in this turbulent state of mind that Zawadi found herself alone in one of the palace gardens one afternoon, staring out over the manicured hedges and blooming flowers. The air was fragrant with the scent of jasmine, and the sun cast long shadows across the stone path. She often came here to escape the pressure of palace life, to breathe and to think. It was here, in the silence of nature, that she could find some semblance of peace. But that day, her solitude was interrupted by a soft voice calling her name. Zawadi. The prince's voice came from behind her, tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Uncertainty, perhaps, or something deeper. She turned around slowly to find Prince Jafari standing at the edge of the garden, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. He was handsome as always, but there was a distance in his gaze that made her heart ache. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this would be a chance for them to reconnect, to speak without the pressures of the palace weighing on them. "Your Highness," Zawadi said, curtsying politely. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety that was building inside her. Jafari nodded curtly, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something, anything. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone urgent but controlled. "It's about your family, the secrets your stepmother has mentioned." Zawadis' heart sank at the mention of her stepmother. Morowa's name, spoken in such a way, filled her with dread. She didn't know what her stepmother had said to the prince, but she could guess. Morowa was a master of manipulation, and she knew how to turn every situation to her advantage. "I don't know what you've been told," Zawadi began, her voice faltering as she looked into Jafari's eyes. "But I swear, I haven't kept any secrets from you. I've always tried to be honest." Jafari stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then tell me, Zawadi, what is this family history your stepmother speaks of? The things she said about you, they don't add up." Zawadi recoiled slightly, the air around her growing thick with tension. She could feel her chest tightening as she struggled to understand what he was asking of her. What was he implying? She had no idea what Morowa had said about her, but she knew it couldn't have been good. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't understand what Morowa has said, but I swear I've done nothing wrong." Jafari's gaze softened for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of doubt. "You have to understand, Zawadi, I'm not questioning your honesty. I just need to know the truth. I need to know where your loyalty lies because there are things happening in this kingdom, things that are bigger than you and me." Zawadi felt a knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure what he was asking of her, but something in his eyes made her believe that he wasn't just talking about family secrets. He was talking about something far darker, something that threatened them both. "I don't know what Morowa has been telling you," Zawadi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But all I've ever wanted was peace. I never wanted any part in your family's games. I don't even understand what's going on. I swear, I don't. I never thought I'd be dragged into this mess." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, and Jafari watched her with an unreadable expression. The vulnerability in her voice, the raw honesty, seemed to crack something inside of him. But even as he felt a pang of guilt for pushing her, he still couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in his mind. Zawadi, sensing the growing despair within her, took a step back. "I don't even know if what you're asking is true. I don't understand all of this family history Morowa speaks of. But if you want me to, I'll tell you what I know." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I don't know the full extent of my family's past, but I know that my mother, my real mother, She was forced into marriage with my father for political reasons. My stepmother has always hated me. Perhaps because I am a reminder of that marriage. She's always plotted against me, ever since I was young. Jafari's expression faltered for a moment, and he took a step closer to her. The confession wasn't what he had expected, but there was something about it that made him question everything. As Zawadi continued, her words became more impassioned, more desperate. I didn't ask for this life, Jafari. I didn't ask to be caught in the middle of this palace intrigue. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to be free of the lies and the games. I didn't choose to be the target of my stepmother's wrath. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with emotion. Jafari stood there, processing what she had said. He wanted to believe her, but his doubts still lingered. There was so much at stake, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Zawadi's family than she was letting on. But in that moment, as they stood there together, there was a connection, fragile, yet undeniable. For the first time, in what felt like forever, Jafari saw Zawadi not as a pawn in a political game, but as a woman, vulnerable, honest, and real. His heart tugged with something deeper than mere curiosity, and though his mind was clouded with confusion, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. Zawadi too felt it, the spark between them that couldn't be easily dismissed. Her emotions, raw and untamed, spilled into the moment, and for a brief second it seemed as though the world around them disappeared. But Jafari's conflict remained unresolved. The bond they shared was undeniable, but the weight of the kingdom, his duty, and the manipulation surrounding them both held him back. As he stood there, torn between his feelings for her and his sense of duty to the throne, Zawadi couldn't help but wonder if their fates were truly tied, or if the games of power would rip them apart. As the days passed, Zawadi found herself increasingly isolated in the palace, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and growing realization. She had always been somewhat aware of the tension between her and her stepmother, Morowa, but now the full extent of her manipulation was beginning to unfold before her eyes. The whispers of those around her, the coldness in their eyes, and the subtle glances exchanged in hushed conversations were all starting to make sense. Morowa had woven a web of lies so intricate that even Zawadi could not see it until now. It was during one of her solitary walks in the garden, where the flowers seemed to bloom with an almost mocking brilliance, that Zawadis' mind began to connect the dots. She thought back to all the little things, how Morowa had always insisted on keeping her close, never allowing her to interact freely with the courtiers, how the whispers from the servants always spoke of Zawadi's beauty but hinted at her family's past, and how every time she tried to ask questions about her mother or her father, Morowa had shut her down with vague answers, or worse, outright lies. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Morowa wasn't just protecting her, she was controlling her, using her as a pawn in some dark game. Zawadi had always felt like a piece on a chessboard, moved around at her stepmother's will. But now she could see the full scope of the plan. Morowa had been planting seeds of doubt in the prince's mind, turning him against her in ways Zawadi had never imagined. Her trust in the people around her began to crumble. She had once believed in the kindness of the servants, in the loyalty of the guards, but now she could see that they were all caught in the same web of manipulation. They were afraid of Morowa, just as she had been. She felt a pang of sorrow for herself and for everyone in the palace who had been swept up in the tide of Morowas' deceit. But this sorrow soon turned into anger. Zawadi had been living under the shadow of her stepmother's cruelty for so long, and now, more than ever, she realized that it was time to stand up for herself. She could no longer be the silent, passive girl in the background, letting everyone else dictate her fate. The truth about her family, her past, and the lies surrounding her had to come to light. But how? She had thought of confiding in the prince, but the distance between them, fueled by Morowas manipulations, had made it impossible. The prince seemed torn between his duty to the throne and his growing feelings for her. She could see the conflict in his eyes every time they spoke. He wanted to trust her, but the doubts planted by Morowa were too strong. He had allowed his sense of duty to cloud his judgment, believing the lies that had been fed to him. Zawadis' heart ached for him. He was trapped just as much as she was, caught between the woman he had been taught to trust and the woman he was slowly beginning to feel something for. But it was also clear that if he did not break free of his stepmother's influence, he would be lost, just as she had been. The turning point came one evening, as Zawadi sat alone in her chambers, her fingers tracing the edge of a letter her mother had once written to her father. It was one of the few things she had of her real family, and it had always brought her comfort. But now, as she read it again, she felt a fire ignite inside her. The words of her mother, the love and pain they conveyed, were more than just sentimental. They were a reminder of who Zawadi truly was, who she had been before the palace, and its politics had consumed her. In that moment, Zawadi knew what she had to do. She could no longer allow Morowas' lies to go unchallenged. She had to confront the prince, lay bare the truth, and expose the deceit that had torn her life apart. No longer would she stand idly by, allowing herself to be manipulated. If she was going to take control of her destiny, she would have to face the prince and risk everything. She stood up, her resolve hardening. It was time for a confrontation that would either free her from the chains of Morowa's lies or doom her to a life of silence and manipulation. Whatever happened, Zawadi was no longer willing to be a pawn in anyone's game. She would find her own way. The next day she sought out the prince, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this would be difficult, but she also knew it was the only way. As she entered the royal hall, her eyes scanned the room, looking for Jafari. When their gazes met, a wave of uncertainty washed over her, but she steeled herself. "Jafari!" she called, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. He turned to her, his expression guarded. "Zawadi, what is it?" Her heart raced, but she stood tall, determined. "I need to speak with you," she said. "No more lies, no more games. I need you to listen to me. Really listen." Jafari looked at her, his eyes softening slightly, but still filled with doubt. "Zawadi, I don't know if I can trust you anymore. What I've been told." "Enough of what you've been told," Zawadi interrupted, her voice rising with a mixture of frustration and hurt. "You've been lied to. Your stepmother has been manipulating both of us, and you've allowed it to continue. But I'm not going to be part of her game any longer." Jafari flinched at her words, the weight of her accusation sinking in. He knew that Morowa had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, but hearing Zawadi say it so plainly forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. Zawadi's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I've spent my entire life being controlled, being told what to do. I've trusted the people around me, but they've all been too afraid to stand up to her. I can't do it anymore. I'm done being a pawn in her game." Jafari took a step forward, his face filled with guilt and confusion. "Zawadi, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe she could be lying to me." Zawadi shook her head. "It's not too late, Jafari. You still have a choice. You can choose to believe me. You can choose to believe that I've never been part of the schemes that have torn this kingdom apart." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jafari saw her, not as a political pawn or a distant figure, but as a woman, full of pain, truth, and determination. The walls around him began to crack. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "Zawadi, I don't know what to believe, but I want to. I want to believe you." And in that moment, something shifted. Zawadi could feel it, the first stirrings of trust. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was just about to begin. Zawadi stood before the prince, her heart racing, but her mind clear. The time had come. She had spent years under the shadow of her stepmother's manipulation, and now, for the first time, she felt the weight of the truth ready to be unleashed. She had never intended for things to go this far, but with every passing day, the lies that Morowa had spun around her grew tighter, choking her hope for a peaceful life. It had to end. Jafari looked at her with those troubled eyes that were still clouded by doubt and confusion. She had never wanted to be the one to expose the darkness surrounding their kingdom, but she had no choice. He had to see the truth, even if it tore their fragile bond apart. "Jafari," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You've been lied to. Morowa has been controlling you, manipulating your thoughts and actions for her own gain. All the things she told you about me, they're lies." Jafari flinched at her words, his face hardening. He had always known there was something off about the way his stepmother had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, but he had never imagined it would go this far. "What do you mean, Zawadi?" he asked, his voice low but tinged with frustration. "What lies? I don't understand." Zawadi took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Morowa has been using me, Jafari. Using me as a pawn in her game to destroy you and your future. She's been feeding you lies about me, making you believe that I'm a threat to your position, that I'm plotting against you." Her voice trembled slightly, but she quickly regained control. "She's been controlling both of us, making us enemies when we should have been allies." Jafari's face softened, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "No, I can't believe that." His voice cracked, the weight of his disbelief pressing down on him. I thought you were part of some plan, that you had your own secrets, that you had something to hide." He took a step back, his eyes searching her face for answers. "But now, hearing you say this, it's too much." Zawadi felt a surge of frustration rise within her, but she fought to keep her composure. "I have nothing to hide, Jafari. All I ever wanted was peace, a life free from the lies that have been controlling me." She took a step closer, her eyes meeting his, full of pain and sincerity. "You've been manipulated, just like I have. Morowa has been playing both of us against each other, and we've been too blind to see it." The prince stared at her, his expression one of utter confusion and heartbreak. The truth was dawning on him, but it felt like a punch to the gut. All the suspicions he had harbored about Zawadi, all the doubts and fears that had clouded his judgment, had been part of a masterful scheme. And now, the weight of his own mistakes hit him harder than any sword ever could. I didn't want to believe it," Jafari murmured, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to believe that you were innocent. I thought I had to protect the throne, protect my future, and I let her turn me against you." He looked down, ashamed, his hands clenching at his sides. "I'm sorry, Zawadi. I am so sorry for everything I've done, for doubting you, for pushing you away when all you ever did was be kind to me." Zawadi could see the pain in his eyes, and for the first time, she saw him not as a prince caught in a game of politics, but as a man who had been caught in the same web of lies that had ensnared her. She could feel her own anger begin to dissolve, replaced by a sense of empathy. He had been just as much a victim as she had. "I never wanted to hurt you," Zawadi said softly. "I never wanted to be part of this. I wanted to live my life in peace, without all of these lies." The prince reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered between them. "What do we do now, Zawadi? How do we fix this?" Zawadi looked at him, her expression hardening with resolve. "We expose her. We take down the lies she's built up and show the kingdom what she's really been doing." Jafari nodded, a sense of determination flickering in his eyes. He had been blind to the truth, but now that he saw it, he knew what had to be done. "I won't let her tear us apart any longer." Well, make sure the truth comes out, no matter the cost. With that, they stood together, united against the force that had torn their lives apart. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation. It was time to confront Morowa and reveal her treachery to the entire kingdom. They would expose her for the schemer she was, and they would rebuild what had been broken between them. Zawadi knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and perhaps even more lies to uncover. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The prince had seen the truth, and now they would fight together to right the wrongs that had been done to them both. As they walked toward the royal chambers to confront Morowa, Zawadi could feel the weight of the future pressing down on her. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkness, and now, with Jafari by her side, she would fight for the light. The truth had been unveiled, and nothing, not even Morowa's schemes, could take that away from them. The day had come. Zawadi stood before the great hall, her heart beating faster than ever. She had never imagined that this moment would be so momentous, but here she was, ready to expose the woman who had caused her so much pain. Her stepmother, Morowa, stood at the heart of the palace's dark, grandiose court, a woman who had once wielded so much power and influence over the royal family. But now, the truth was about to unravel everything she had worked for. Jafari stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. The prince had become her ally in ways she had never thought possible. Together, they had gathered the evidence needed to bring Morowa down. The hidden letters, the secret meetings, and the carefully constructed lies, the pieces of the puzzle, were all in place. Now, the court would see the truth. Zawadi's hand tightened around the papers in her grip, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As they entered the hall, all eyes turned toward them. The courtiers, once so indifferent or hostile toward Zawadi, now watched in silence, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Morowa stood across the room, her eyes glinting with the cold arrogance that Zawadi had grown so accustomed to. She looked every inch the queen she had once aspired to be, her regal posture betraying no hint of the treachery she had orchestrated. But Zawadi knew better now. Beneath the polished exterior, Morowa was nothing more than a liar and manipulator. "Morowa!" Zawadi's voice rang out, steady and unflinching. "It's time the kingdom knows the truth." The court fell into a heavy silence. Morowa's eyes narrowed as she turned to face Zawadi, her smile faltering slightly, though she quickly regained her composure. "What nonsense is this, Zawadi? You've already caused enough trouble with your lies. Now you think you can—" "I'm not the one lying," Zawadi interrupted, her voice calm but filled with authority. "You are. You've been using me to manipulate the prince, to tear us apart for your own gain. Your web of lies ends today." With a swift motion, Zawadi handed the gathered evidence to the royal scribe. The scribe began reading aloud the damning letters and documents that exposed Morowa's plots. Her schemes to ruin Zawadi's reputation, her manipulation of Jafari, and her twisted ambitions to seize control of the throne. The once proud woman, so accustomed to wielding her power behind the scenes, now stood exposed for all to see. Morowa's face drained of colour as the truth came crashing down around her. Her eyes flicked to Jafari, who had been standing beside Zawadi, his face grim and resolute. The prince's support was unwavering, and his gaze was filled with the deep regret of having been deceived for so long. I had to do it," Morowa stammered, her composure completely shattered. "You don't understand, Jafari. It was the only way. I needed to secure our future, your future." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The court was already murmuring, the members of the royal family now fully aware of the depths of her betrayal. There would be no excuse that could save her now. Zawadi stepped forward, her heart no longer weighed down by fear or doubt. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all Morowa. "You sought to destroy my future to build your own," she said firmly. "But you forgot that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it." With a final disgusted glance at her stepmother, Zawadi turned to the gathered nobles and courtiers. "This is the woman who has poisoned our kingdom with lies. It's time she faces the consequences of her actions." The court erupted in shocked whispers, the nobles exchanging looks of disbelief as they processed the truth. Morowa's lies had held them captive for too long, and now that power was slipping through her fingers. The once mighty woman stood alone in the center of the hall. Her power, her influence, her ambition, everything she had worked for, crumbling before her eyes. Jafari stepped forward, his voice cold and resolute. "You have betrayed us all, Morowa. For your lies, you will be exiled from this kingdom. Your power has been stripped away, and you will no longer hold any sway over this court." The decree was clear, and the consequences were final. The courtiers watched in silence as Morowa was escorted out of the palace, her fate sealed. The kingdom was free of her influence, but the scars of her betrayal would remain for some time. As the court began to stir, Zawadi felt a sense of vindication wash over her. The weight of the years spent under Morowa's thumb had been lifted, and in its place, a newfound strength blossomed within her. She had done it. She had exposed the truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself, and the prince, from the manipulation that had bound them both. Jafari approached her, his face filled with sorrow and admiration. "I am sorry for doubting you, Zawadi, for all that I've put you through." He took her hands in his grip warm and sincere. "You've shown me what real strength is. I don't know how I can ever make up for all the pain I caused you." Zawadi smiled, though it was a smile filled with both relief and sorrow. "There's nothing to forgive, Jafari. We've both been victims of Morowas' lies, but now we can move forward." And with that, the prince and Zawadi stood side by side, united in purpose and in heart. Together, they would rebuild what had been broken, forging a future based on honesty, love, and mutual respect. The people of the kingdom, once wary and divided, began to see the truth as well. Zawadi, who had once been treated as a pawn, was now recognized as the strong, brave woman she had always been. She had fought for her future and, in doing so, had earned the respect of the kingdom. In the days that followed, the court began to heal. Morowa's exile was the first step in a series of changes that would restore balance to the kingdom. Jafari and Zawadi worked together to dismantle the corruption that had taken root under her reign, bringing prosperity and peace back to the land. Their relationship, once clouded by doubt and deception, was now grounded in trust, and their shared vision for the kingdom grew stronger with each passing day. A new chapter had begun for both of them, one filled with hope, unity, and the promise of a future where truth would always triumph over lies. The kingdom was finally free from the darkness that had threatened to destroy it, and under the leadership of Jafari and Zawadi, it would thrive once more. As they stood together on the balcony overlooking the vast kingdom, Zawadi turned to Jafari, her heart filled with a quiet joy. "We've done it, haven't we?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with wonder. Jafari smiled, his eyes shining with a deep affection. "Yes, Zawadi. Together, we've done it. And now, we'll build a future where nothing can tear us apart." And as the sun set on the kingdom, casting a golden light over the land, Zawadi knew that at last, her fight for truth had brought her the one thing she had always longed for, a life built on trust, love, and the unshakable bond between her and the prince.